Hello, welcome to another episode of the History of Comic Books podcast. This is your friendly host, neighborhood host, JT Wheatley here again, back for part 2 of the History of Crime comic books. When we last left off, Crime Does Not Pay reset the comic book crime genre with tales from the criminal's perspective and about bad guys, and with naturally many imitators on the boots. And of course, this drew natural criticism, but that didn't stop them. Even Lev Gleason Publications expanded on the crime genre, and on April 1948, Crime and Punishment premiered, hosted by Officer Common Sense, a ghost of a cop killed in the line of duty, and called it Illustrations to appeal to adults. Also overseen by Charles Barrow and Bob Wood of Crime Does Not Pay, it would run for 74 issues until 1954, but unlike their premiere comic, Crime Does Not Pay, it focused on more tales of police officers in the vein of this narrator. Victor Fox and his Fox Feature Syndicate, of course, joined in his own sleazy way with Murder Incorporated on January 1948, Famous Criminals in June of that same year, and Crimes by Women in June of 1948 as well. For Murder Incorporated, Fox even put an adults-only tag on the cover, a cynical move knowing that it would make kids want to read it even more. The comic stories reflected Fox's cheap, exploitive business practices as well, when criminals killing for pocket change while bad girls tucked pistols away in their underwear. The art wasn't that good either, especially since Fox rarely paid well, and as a result, each series had a number of one-shot artists. Eventually, Victor Fox's crime comics were so bad that they were mocked in Mad Magazine with a strip called Victor Wolf, a comics publisher whose comics company's motto was Wolf Comics Makes 'Em Howl. Crimes by Women was specifically mocked as the fictional Wolf comics had titles like Crimes by Criminals and Crimes by Dogs. DS Publishing produced Gangsters Can't Win on February 1948, along with Underworld and Exposed in March of that same year, Public Enemies in June, Whodunit in August, and finally in July, Select Detectives and Payoff. However, the entire company would be disbanded by that very next year. For EC Comics, Blackstone the Magician Detective Fights Crime was produced in fall of 1947, with War on Crime and International Crime Patrol joining the series in 1948. However, these titles would later be changed to Crypt of Terror, and then later Terror from the Crypt, and The Vault of Horror in October of 1950 as part of EC Comics' legendary New Trend line. EC did return to the crime genre with crime suspense stories in October of 1950 as well, though the series was a break from previous crime comic books and it focused on domestic crime with the criminals rarely caught. Johnny Craig was its most popular artist, especially with the covers, which included the infamous one on issue number 22 of a killer holding a bloody axe in one hand and a woman's severed head in the other, which would of course become the focus of the Senate subcommittee on juvenile delinquency years later. By 1948 to 49, 160 million crime comic books were sold. However, many of their titles were not truthful. For example, All True Crime Comics was actually completely fictitious, as was Real Clue Crime comic stories. It even used fake models for the crime scenes. Photo covers did become more prevalent during this time for all comic books, and the crime genre was no exception, as they were used to depict real crime scenes. The made-up stories were like Trevor Underbelly, who died in his own bed but didn't mention his wife or the honeymoon. He was actually a real criminal, but they always like to fudge the stories a little bit. In general, criminals were made to look worse, while cops and law enforcement were made to look better, including FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who was depicted honorably in The True Life of the Story of Alan Harpies, the story in the comic Justice Traps the Guilty in January 1948 by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. Another example was Two Gun Crawley in Crime Does Not Pay on July of 1948. At the time, the MPAA, under the Hays Code, refused to allow criminals to have nicknames in films, as they felt it glamorized them. However, comic books had no such code yet, so they could name away, with Machine Gun Kelly, Babyface Nelson, and Pretty Boy Floyd. In addition, the comics could also use curse words like hell and damn, while depicting scenes of torture and murder. This was, like I said, the 1940s after all. Immoral women could even be depicted, even as Mrs. Bluebeard in Crime Does Not Pay on March of 1946, and rape was even implied in the story Girl Trap in Wanted Comics on March of 1952. Drugs and alcohol also ran rampant throughout the crime comic books. Of course, the violent content would bring scrutiny, and in 1948, a study was commissioned in Dayton, Ohio, which discovered that half of young adults, 21 to 30, were comic book readers. To skew this market, Crime Does Not Pay started carrying the warning on its cover, not intended for children, though that only encouraged children to check out the comic book even more. Plus, it wasn't long before it brought the attention of one notorious critic, Frederick Werban. As discussed in the previous War on Comics episodes, Wervin had studied comics in the late 1940s and claimed they caused juvenile delinquency on May 29, 1948 in the Saturday Review of Literature article, The Comics. Very funny. Wervin focused on crime comics, but he wasn't original, as nearly a century earlier in 1850, Jack Shepherd penny sheets were blamed for causing crime. In the current time, crime comics were blamed for causing crime itself, with Time running an article on October 4th, 1948, about a 14-year-old boy who poisoned a 50-year-old woman over a comic. Soon, Crime Does Not Pay was cited by the Minister of Justice of the Dominion of Canada with legislation outlawing crime comic books. In response, the comic book detailed its editorial standards in its May 1948 issue, pointing out that stories couldn't have criminals enjoying the crimes they committed, no bad women, and to treat cops favorably. Crime and Punishment, however, violated those standards on June of 1948, despite being Crime Does Not Pay's sister book at Lou Givens Publishing. On January 1st, 1948, the Association of Comic Magazine Publishers, or ACMP, was established by publishers to self-regulate the industry with the intention of prohibiting torture, lewd women, and divorce. It was, like I keep saying, the 1940s in comic books, but only 12 of the 35 publishers at the time participated, and those that did ignored the rules anyway. Nevertheless, Crime Does Not Pay publisher Liv Gleason defended himself with a letter to Lieutenant Conniver on his committee in 1950, which was originally concluded that comic books did not cause crime. That then deterred Frederick Wervin, who launched an All Our Innocence in 1952 and later published Seduction of the Innocent in 1954, where he singled out crime comics as a waste and created moral and ethical confusion among readers. Wervin said the message of a comic book should be crime does pay and pays well. On April 21st, 1954, the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency was formed in New York City, and the story of Frisco Mary was highlighted from the crime comic book Crime Must Pay the Penalty from August of 1949, in which the title character is a grifter who kills a cop. The highlight of the hearing was Bill Gaines' poorly timed response to Senator Conniver's question on whether to cover a crime suspense stories number 22, featuring a criminal holding a woman's severed head, was in good taste, and he sadly responded, it was. The backlash was instant, and comic book publishers knew they had to do something before to mollify the public outrage. The solution was the Comic Magazine Association of America, or CMA, which was formed on September 10, 1954, with the Comics Code Authority, or CCA, being formed on October 26, 1954, to regulate the comic book content. One section, Editorial Matter, General Standards Part A, which was devoted to crime comics, stated criminals could not be glorified or give details about how to commit a crime. Headed by Charles F. Murphy, it quickly became an impediment to any creative output, with 285 out of 440 titles rejected the first year alone. Despite this, Frederick Wervin, on April 1955, called it ineffective. One thing Liv Gleason did make sure of, though, was that crime comics, particularly his Crime Does Not Pay, was protected, as the word crime was not banned from titles, unlike horror or terror. Nevertheless, the backlash against comic books continued, as many readers and retailers boycotted them, while states and local governments passed restrictions against them. California, in particular, passed a law banning the sale of any crime comic books to minors. On May of 1955, New York banned the sale of obscene comics to minors, which included crime comics. Soon, despite Liv Gleason's efforts, Crime Does Not Pay, a trend-setting comic book and one of the most successful of all time, was canceled later that year, having been converted to police and mystery stories. EC Comics tried to keep the crime comic genre going with Crimes Illustrated, a black and white magazine, believing that the same success they had with Mad Magazine would translate to others in late 1955. Being a magazine, it fell out of the CCA's jurisdiction. Sadly, it ultimately failed, with Mad being EC's only book. By 1957, there were only 6 crime comic book titles being sold, a genre that once dominated the industry. However, by 1960, Dell started to adapt detective TV shows like 77 Sunset Strip on January of 1960, Peter Sisko in April of 1960, The Detectives in March of 1961, and The Untouchables in October of 1961. Each comic used picture covers from the TV shows, though the creators soon discovered the CCA was even more constricted than the TVs now. This, despite the fact that Dell never joined the CCA due to its own in-house code. In 1970, another black and white magazine, Murder Tales, was tried that November, which ran Tales of the Killers in its December 1970 issue, a reprint for the original Crime Does Not Pay run. Soon, other magazines like Crime Machine on February 1971 and The Days of the Mob in fall of 1971 appeared, the latter which was edited by the legendary Jack Kirby, who also did writing and art chores. However, soon comic books were able to get back into the fold as Part B of the CCA was changed to allow drug use as long as it was depicted negatively, in response to a Marvel Amazing Spider-Man anti-drug comic. Comics could also show corrupt officials and cops could be killed. However, there would still be few new crime comics outside of Lady Cop in July of 1975. The crime comic genre did grow outside the U.S., particularly in Europe and Asia, with series like M.W. about a banker who lives a double life as a kidnapper, and The Book of Human Insects, an elaborate story about murder and blackmail by the legendary Osamu Tezuka, and Golgo 13, about an assassin for hire by Tokoro Sato in Japan. In the 1980s, the crime genre started to rebound again, with Mrs. Tree's thrilling detective adventures, appearing on February 1983 with Eclipse, and written by Max Allan Collins with art by Terry Beatty. The character was first appeared in the story Eye for an Eye in 1981 from Eclipse magazine by Eclipse Comics, telling the story of Mrs. Tree, who takes over her husband's private detective business after he is murdered. Collins stated his inspiration was Mike Hammer's secretary Velda, with his pitch being, imagine if Mike Hammer and Velda finally got married and on their honeymoon he is murdered. Collins also implied, but could never outright state, that Mrs. Tree was the daughter of the lead detective from the Dragnet TV show Joe Friday. Later, Mrs. Tree Quarterly was published at DC in 1990s, having bounced from Eclipse to Aardvark to Renegade. The Mage Agency was published on December of 1988 by writer Mike Barr and artist Alan Davis, about a pair of detectives, Jennifer Mays, an ex-CIA agent, and Gabriel Webb, a true crime writer, and their adventures solving puzzling murders. The series was noted for playing fair with the readers, and that they received clues at the same time the detectives in the stories did. Thus, the readers got a chance to solve the crime case along with them. This was similar to a concept of the Ellery Queen stories, which Mike Barr admitted was an inspiration for the series. He even had Ellery Queen guest star in The Maze Agency No. 9, though sometimes some stories were too complex even for the average reader to figure out. The series was so acclaimed it received a nomination for Best New Series at the 1989 Eisner Awards. Its first 7 issues were published by Comico Comics before the company went under in 1989, and was then picked up by Innovation Comics for another 16 issues, along with an annual and a special issue, and lasted until 1991. The series has since bounced around from company to company, with Moonstone providing the most recent series in 2009. It was during the 1990s that crime comic book genre started to really reawaken, and it only made sense as the original crime comic book strip, Dick Tracy, finally had an adaptation to the big screen on June 14, 1990, starring and directed by Warren Beatty. While the film received a slightly positive reaction, it was mostly acclaimed for its set design and makeup effects, which brought many of Dick Tracy's colorful villains to life. Joan Caglione Jr. and Doug Drexler won the Oscar for their makeup work. The film also won for art direction and best original song, Sooner or Later, I Always Get My Man, and with 3 Oscar wins, remains the most a comic book movie has ever won at the Oscars. Even The Dark Knight has only won 2 Oscars. The film also received numerous other nominations, notably Al Pacino in his scene-stealing performance as Big Boy Pacrice for Best Supporting Actor. The film was a solid financial hit, grossing $162.7 million worldwide against a $45 million budget, though not enough to launch a franchise. However, Warren Beatty continues to maintain the film and TV rights to Dick Tracy, which he purchased in 1985, and retains them to this day. And in doing so, he filmed a bizarre TV special with film critic Leonard Maltin, who interviewed Beatty playing Dick Tracy about the possibility of a sequel. The special aired on Turner Classic Movies, and while it seems weird when viewed out of context, it allowed Beatty to retain the rights to Dick Tracy. As being made in 2010, it actually extended them. This was what the judge cited when he ruled in his favor on March 26th of 2011. However, Beatty has yet to actually make any new Dick Tracy film or TV material. As for the original Dick Tracy comic book strip, it still runs this day with current writer Mike Curtis and artist Joe Stanton. While the series has gone through some crazy up and downs, notably when Dick Tracy got a spacecraft in the 1960s, it remains a stalwart strip to this day, and there is something comforting that the original comic book strip to help out the crime comic book genre is still running. Perhaps the most popular crime comic book series created in the last few decades has been Sin City by Frank Miller, who reportedly made it after his horrible experience in Hollywood trying to write the RoboCop film sequels. Miller stated he wanted to make stories how he wanted to, and in Sin City his motto was, the trench coats would be long, the guns would be huge, the cars would be vintage, and the women would be beautiful. The series first appeared in Dark Horse Presents' 5th Anniversary Special in 1991 with the first story, The Hard Goodbye, which would also introduce the series' most popular character, the near superhuman tough guy Marv. Serialized in Dark Horse Presents number 51 to 62. It was soon followed by Sin City, A Dame to Kill For, The Big Fat Kill, That Yellow Bastard, Family Values, Booze, Bras, and Bullets, and finally To Hell and Back. Always took place in Basin City, otherwise known as Sin City, a fictionalized American Western town where the narrative and characters jump back and forth throughout. The series was mostly in black and white, with the occasional use of color. For example, in That Yellow Bastard, the title character is depicted in yellow. Plus, while this is supposed to be a crime comic book, it does stretch the limit, with characters breaking more than a few laws of physics. Marv is, quite frankly, near superhuman. It was a crime comic book, though, but one that was on steroids. Sin City was an instant commercial and critical success, with The Hard Goodbye winning the Eisner for Best Reprint in 1993, while A Dame to Kill For won the Eisner for Best Limited Series in 1995, with many considering it today to be Frank Miller's best work. A highly acclaimed movie was made in 2005 with Robert Rodriguez and Frank Miller directing, a co-directing credit that resulted in Rodriguez leaving the Directors Guild of America over the archaic rules that said that wasn't allowed to have co-directing credit. Of interesting note, Frank Miller did throw in a copy of RoboCop's gun in the trunk of one of the scenes as a nod to the fact that it was the work on that movie that made him launch Sin City. A less successful follow-up, Sin City: A Dame to Kill For, was made in 2014. In 1993, Paul Grist started Kane, a black-and-white comic series about a police detective who works in the fictional city of New Eden, who has a difficult relationship with the rest of the police force due to a violent encounter with his partner, which over the course of several issues is fully explained. The original run went for 29 issues before Grist decided to focus on superhero work, such as this series Jack Flag, but he stated he would return to Kane with the occasional graphic novel. Back in Japan, one of the most popular crime mangas was Detective Conan, known as Case Closed in America due to copyright issues with the name Conan, about a teenage detective who, after being attacked by a criminal syndicate, is forced to take a formula that turns him into a young boy. He still keeps up his detective work, working under a pseudonym to keep his true identity secret. Premiering on January 19, 1994, the series continues to this day, and like any successful manga, of course has an anime adaptation. The manga series remains successful to this day, when with 200 million total books sold, is the 4th best-selling manga of all time. In 1995, the popular cult series Stray Bullets was released by El Capitan Books and creator David Lapham, a black-and-white crime series that took place from the 1970s and 1990s, with various characters and stories interweaving with each other. It was an instant critical success, with winning the Eisner in 1996 for Best Writer, Artist, and Drama, while the trade collection Innocence of Nihilism won the 1997 Eisner for Best Graphic Novel Reprint. However, its erratic schedule kept the series from becoming a larger success, as it took nearly 10 years till 2005 for the 40th issue to come out. Latham returned to the series in 2014 with an 8-issue miniseries Killers, and plans to continue in this format at Image Comics. In 1997, a History of Violence graphic novel was released, created by writer John Wagner and artist Vince Locke, about a small-town Mexican cafe owner who gets targeted by the mob after he stops a robbery, and they believe he's actually someone else from their past. The highly acclaimed story was later adapted in the film in 2005 by the same name, directed by David Cronenberg and starring Viggo Mortensen, and it earned the Best Supporting Actor nomination for William Hurt, along with a Best Screenplay nomination at the Oscars, though it has a significantly different ending than the book. In 1998, The Road to Perdition by writer Max Allan Collins and artist Richard Piers Brainer, about a ruthless but honorable mob hitman, Michael O'Sullivan, who, after being betrayed by his bosses, flees with his surviving son, Michael Jr. The series was inspired by the legendary Lone Wolf and Cub manga series and would spawn 4 sequels: On the Road to Perdition, Road to Purgatory, Road to Paradise, and The Return to Perdition, along with a movie adaptation in 2002 starring Tom Hanks. Collins, of course, created the Mystery series back in the 1980s, and most significantly was the writer who took over Dick Tracy strip when his creator, Chester Gould, retired in 1977. On June of 1999, one of the most acclaimed crime comic books was released with 100 Bullets, #1, by writer Brian Azzarello and artist Edward Rizzo, The primary concept was each story began with a mysterious Agent Graves who would give someone an attaché case with a gun, 100 bullets, and documents on the cause of that person's grief. The interesting thing about the gun and the bullets is that they were completely untraceable, and whether they were used on, no one could ever trace them back to the user. To demonstrate this, one of the users shot a dog in the middle of a park and waited for the police to show up, smoking gun still in hand. They showed up and didn't even bother the man, believing someone else shot the dog. While it started as an anthology series, it soon morphed into a larger narrative as the plan behind Agent Graves' giving the attaché cases is slowly revealed. The series continued until April of 2009, ending on Naturally, the 100th issue. It remains one of the most popular and acclaimed crime comic books, if not comic books in general, in recent decades. Before Brian Michael Bendis made a name for himself as a superhero writer, he produced a number of great crime comic books, notably Goldfish in 1994, about a con man trying to reclaim his son, Jinx in 1997, about a female bounty hunter, and Torso in 1998, an adaptation of Elliot Ness's real-life investigation of the Torso Slayer of Cleveland, Ohio. Bendis even merged the crime and superhero genres when writing on a spin-off from Spawn, Sam and Twitch, about the detective partners, and Powers in 2000, with artist Michael Avon Oeming, about two homicide detectives charged with investigating superpowered crimes in a world where superpowers are real. Another book that merged the superhero and crime genre was Gotham Central by writers Ed Brubaker and Greg Rucka, along with artist Michael Lark, which followed the stories of the Gotham City Police Department, who must work in a city with Batman and his villains. Highly acclaimed, the series ran from December 2002 to April of 2006 for a total of 40 issues, and in 2004 won the Eisner and Harvey for its story Half a Life. Ed Brubaker also created his own brilliant crime noir series in Criminal with artist Sean Phillips, an anthology series about different crime stories, all connected in a larger universe. First appearing under Marvel's Icon line in October of 2006 before moving on to Image Comics, the series has been published in various miniseries involving different criminals and crime stories ever since, with the most recent series having launched in early of 2019. Of course, in this revival of crime comic books, adaptations was part of the mix, with the most exciting being the late Darwin Cook's work on the Richard Stark's Donald Westlake's Parker novels, in which he adapted the classic crime novels from 2009 to 2013, beginning with The Hunter, then The Outfit, The Score, and The Slayground. A classic series about Parker, an immoral criminal who, quite frankly, has something of an honorable streak, but still is a bad guy. It remains one of Darwin Cook's best work to date, and is highly recommended to pick up. And with that is a rambling history of the crime comic book genre. As you can see, like film, TV, and radio, the crime genre has a significant presence in comic book medium and makes an important addition for any reading. I would like to point out the main source of these episodes was the Illustrated History of the Crime Comics by Mike Benton, an excellent book that covers most of the history of the comic book genre up to the 1980s. While out of print now, I got a used library copy. It's still well worth reading for those interested in the subject. And now it is June 26, 2025, time for the favorite comic of the week. Ultimate Spider-Man number 18 by Jonathan Hickman and Marco Dichetto, which finds Peter Parker Spider-Man returning to New York City to help Harry Osborn, the Green Goblin, fight the Sinister Six, only for both their families start to complicate the matters. Hickman does a great job really bringing the Peter Parker back in action after being on hiatus because he's bound to run with identity now exposed to the Sinister Six. And seeing him and Harry pair up and fight off is great. It harkens back to their friendship in the original comic. And it's kind of interesting, too, because, Green Goblin's more or less a hero in this, fighting alongside Spider-Man, which is very cool. And, very fun to watch. And the Chichel's art is fantastic. Once again, especially with the action sequences, all the character designs. And all that plus a killer cliffhanger that's like, oh boy, things are about to get really complicated for everybody. Just a great read in general, and still the best Spider-Man book on the stands. Though I have to say also the Predator vs. Spider-Man number 3 came out, and that's the second best book right now. Yeah, if you want a good Spider-Man, Ultimate Spider-Man and Predator vs. Spider-Man, those are the two best ones right now. And with that, we'll conclude with this archive edition of the History of Kind comic books. Join me again next week for probably another archive edition. Hopefully, with it being around the 4th of July holiday, maybe something nicely American themed. We'll see where we go with that.
But until then, go enjoy yourself a good comic book. And if you can, definitely pick up Ultimate Spider-Man and Predator vs. Spider-Man. They are both fantastic, and they are the Spider-Man books that we should be reading over Amazing Spider-Man right now.